Good evening. Welcome to our presentation tonight on white Christian nationalism. This is a workshop that I did earlier this year at the annual meeting of the Vermont Conference of the United Church of Christ. And not typically what I do on Sunday mornings, not in part because it's a lot longer than I usually talk on Sunday mornings. And content-wise, it's a little more pointed maybe than I would be on a Sunday morning. So anyway, the gist of it is I figured since I did all the work to put it together, I ought to present it more than once. And so I'm really grateful that you wanted to come and listen tonight. I appreciate that. My perspective, who are you listening to? Just so you know, I am in favor of the separation of church and state in every possible way that the church and the state can be kept separate. A church that receives subsidies from the government will be compromised and diminished by doing so, and a government that grants favors to one religion over another is not a government of all the people. I love my country, and I'm concerned about the way that white Christian nationalism and those perspectives are influencing and degrading our democracy. But I'm also even more concerned as a Christian minister, as a follower of Christ, about what white Christian nationalism does in terms of distorting and eroding the teachings of Jesus. That's what white Christian nationalism does. It's bad public policy and it's bad religion at the same time. But it's, as we'll see in just a minute, it's also very, very old, especially in our country, but older than our country as well. So, you know, there are questions because it seems quite pervasive, and it is not without adherents, not without proponents, and not without powerful people who want to see white Christian nationalism flourish because they benefit from it so much. So what's to become of the church, of the teachings of Christ, what's to become of our democracy if this perspective, white Christian nationalism, continues to have so much sway in our common civic life? Let's start with some definitions about the term. I intentionally, sometimes I get to talking and I'll shorten it down to Christian nationalism just because white Christian nationalism is a mouthful to say, but I try to remember to always include white Christian nationalism because without the white part of it, the rest of it doesn't really make sense. The favoring and the privileging that happens when Christian nationalists or religious nationalist perspectives are flourishing, the favoring throughout our history has always been the white folks. And it's been minorities and others on the margins who have been othered by this perspective to their expense and to the benefit of white folks, primarily white male folks, but there's that. White Christian nationalism is a label, that may be a little because we try to avoid labeling, but we have to have some kind of handle to describe this because we see this behavior, we see these perspectives being shared in all manner of places, and not just on the radio or on news talk shows or on websites. These perspectives are walking the halls of state governments, of Congress, and other places where influential decision makers sit every day in the life of our government on state and federal level. So, to be a white Christian nationalist, a couple of things to keep in mind. Think spectrum. Somebody's going to be extremely so, and somebody's going to be barely so, and there will be nuance, and there'll be things that just kind of creep in. Things like, well, that's the way we've always done it. How could that be? How could there be something wrong with that? And so it's helpful if we can talk about ideas and perspectives and understandings as opposed to people and personalities. So there are going to be some folks who embrace the values of white Christian nationalism, but they don't want the label. No, they would not self-identify as a white Christian nationalist, though they appreciate the tenets of it. There'll be some folks who embrace the values and embrace the label. They don't mind being identified as a white Christian nationalist. There'll be folks somewhere in there who don't really understand, white Christian nationalist, that's just a word the liberals came up with, and I don't, but what they want to be is just kind of middle of the road, and they want to continue to Christianize or religify the country, but they also want to maintain traditional democratic institutions that are a part of making our democracy work. And then there are folks like Jack Posobiec, speaking at CPAC earlier this year, and I quote, "Welcome to the end of democracy. We're here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way there on January the 6th, but we will endeavor to fight and to get rid of it and replace it with this right here." And he holds up what appears to be a cross on a chain, "because all glory is not to government, all glory to God." So there are some folks who are true believers and want all of us to be true believers. And then there are some other folks who are disturbed by the events of January the 6th, 2021. And that's the picture in the slide there is from that day. You see a person who I think that's a prayer posture with using the Trump flag as maybe a prayer shawl and bowing before a cross, obviously a religious symbol, so I'm not saying you should, I'm just saying if you don't have anything else to do and you go back to watch video from January the 6th, and look for religious symbols. They're all over the place that day. And so. Yeah.
How does this interact with Zionism?
I'm going to need, I'm not hearing you real well. Let's wait till after we're done to do questions. So, nationalism. What nationalism and religious nationalism, none of those things are new, and none of those things are unique to America. One definition, the fusion of nationalism and religion such that they are inseparable. Both religion and nationalism are order-creating cultural systems, forms of social identity. They tell us who we are, and they tell us where we should go and when we should go there and how we should behave, and they tell us all kinds of things about ourselves, and a lot of times, we need those things. We like to not have to make all those decisions. But religious nationalism obviously relies on religious identities and myths to define the nation, define the nation's story and its goals. Probably two of the most, Iran and Israel, I think, are two nations right now currently that fit that religious nationalism example. One of the things that we're truly blessed with right now is just the number of bright young minds, and by young I mean younger than 60, who are doing this work of ferreting through all this stuff and analyzing, and there are historians who are writing about white Christian nationalism, they're political scientists, they're theologians, they're social scientists, all sorts of people are trying to help us make sense of what's happening to our country, not the least of which is a woman whose name I can't pronounce real well. Kristen Kobe-Dumez, this is how she defines the white Christian nationalism in our country. For evangelicals, domestic and foreign policy are two sides of the same coin. Christian nationalism, the belief that America is God's chosen nation and must be defended as such, serves as a powerful predictor of intolerance toward immigrants, racial minorities, and non-Christians. It's linked to the opposition to gay rights and to gun control, to support for harsher punishments for criminals, to justifications for the use of excessive force against Black Americans in law enforcement situations, and to traditionalist gender ideology. White evangelicals have pieced together this patchwork of issues and a nostalgic commitment to rugged, aggressive, militant white masculinity serves as a thread binding them together into a coherent whole. A father's rule in the home is inextricably linked to the heroic leadership on the national stage, and the fate of the nation hinges on both. For conservative white evangelicals, the good news of the Christian gospel has become inextricably linked to a staunch commitment to patriarchal authority, gender difference, and Christian nationalism. All of these are intertwined with white racial identity. Many Americans who now identify as evangelicals are identifying with this operational theology, one that is Republican in its politics and traditionalist in its values. This God and country faith is championed by those who regularly attend evangelical churches and those who do not. In this way, conservative white evangelicalism has become a polarizing force in American politics. What she's talking there about, particularly in that second paragraph, is religious nationalism or white Christian nationalism has so distorted what the Christian faith is over the last 40, 50 years especially, that it's the only Christianity that somebody who was born in the last 30 years may have ever seen. And so when those people, I don't know, one of the things that if you follow, current political events, this week, there have been two national calls. One titled Christians for Kamala, and another one titled Evangelicals for Kamala. And what did I say? Kamala? Kamala. Thank you. But that's astounding. And what it's causing is causing folks who are more conservative to say, you're not Christian. If you're supporting her, you can't be Christian. Because the only kind of Christianity they've ever seen is this distorted white Christian nationalist kind of Christianity. They've never seen a Christian faith that just went about being Christian and didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to do anything politically, other than just going to the polls and voting when the time came to go in the polls and vote. So now that all of that has kind of been co-opted, and for folks who are just casual observers and not actually people who practice the faith, you think that's what Christianity is, what you see on TV, what you see these folks doing. So that's Dumez's definition. Andrew Whitehead, his definition, a cultural framework asserting that all civic life in the United States should be organized according to a particular form of conservative Christianity. It leads us to practice various forms of idolatry, revering a god or gods other than Jesus, trusting in them for protection and provision. And then the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which has been in this space for 80 years this year, trying to maintain the wall between the church and state and keeping those things separate, defines it as a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. Christian nationalism contends that America has been and should always be distinctively Christian from top to bottom in its self-identity and interpretations of its own history, sacred symbols, cherished values, public policies, the whole 9 yards. And it aims to keep it that way. But, and here's an important distinction, and kind of in a concise way gets to what I was trying to say just now. The Christian and Christian nationalism is more about identity than it is about religion, than it is about authentic practice or something that really makes a religious impact on a person's life. It carries with it assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, patriarchy, and militarism. And this is the last definition we're going to read is from Catherine Stewart. She wrote a book, she's a columnist, I think, and she wrote a book called The Power Worshippers, and this quote is from that book. For too long now, America's Christian nationalist movement has been misunderstood and underestimated. Most Americans continue to see it as a cultural movement centered on a set of social issues such as abortion and same-sex marriage, preoccupied with symbolic conflicts over monuments and prayers. But the religious right has become more focused and powerful, even as it arguably is less representative. It's not a social or a cultural movement, it's a political movement, and its ultimate goal is power. It does not seek to add another voice to America's pluralistic democracy, but to replace our foundational democratic principles and institutions with a state grounded on a particular version of Christianity, answering to what some adherents call a biblical worldview that also happens to serve the interest of its plutocratic funders and allied political leaders. The movement is unlikely to realize its most extreme visions, but it has already succeeded in degrading our politics, dividing our nation with religious animus. This is not a cultural war. It's a war over the future of democracy. Yeah, I had slides for all of those. So as we talk about, with those definitions, as we talk about some of how we got here, what our history looks like, it's kind of like putting a puzzle together. If the puzzle is not finished yet, and if you could take all the pieces that you're working with and put them back in the box and take out a whole nother set of pieces and start working with them, then what we're about to do is kind of like working a puzzle like that. Bit of a moving target. And the other thing that happens is once you see this stuff and see how much a part of our story it has been since pre-colonial times, you start to see it in more places. There are a lot of folks, from this perspective who will say in all earnestness, America was founded as a Christian nation. And probably most of you would say, no, we were not. And we have a constitution, we have separation of church and state, we have the First Amendment, we have all the founding fathers who were deists, and we have all our But then you go back and you look at our history and the influence and the privilege that white Christians experienced on this continent decade after decade after decade after decade after decade. The decisions that got made in their favor and got made by them and for them. It's understandable why when folks look back, having enjoyed that privilege decade after decade, and seeing that privilege sort of maybe being pulled back and not being as much a part of their existence, their place in our culture, they raise a ruckus and start to protest that. But where does it start? And you pick a place. I chose Constantine's baptism. Let me make sure. I may have a slide for that. Yeah, I do. Constantine's baptism. Some of you may, if you remember the night that Jesus was arrested in the garden, Peter drew a sword and he took off an ear, of all things, of one of the Roman soldiers who was coming to arrest Jesus. And Jesus told Peter to put away his sword, and he healed that guard and got arrested and went on to be crucified. So now it doesn't happen when Constantine is baptized, but that's step one. The emperor after him will eventually make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And what happens there is Christianity, which has been a persecuted minority movement all the way up until now, all of a sudden gets the sword back. Christianity has power, immense power. The power that only comes from the most powerful nation on earth, which presumably Rome was at the time, or at least thought it was at the time. So, yeah, and we could spend the whole time just talking about that, because you get, Christianity, official religion of the empire. And, eventually that's going to lead to the Borgias, and, that's the start of it. Eventually, Jesus, the mascot, will replace Jesus, the liberator. You could make the argument that the movement that Jesus started ended when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Because you certainly make the argument that it would never look the same again. And this is the time when the mothers and fathers start fleeing to the desert because they see what's coming. And they just want to go sit in a cave by themselves and pray because they're convinced that nothing good is going to happen for their faith if they stay in populated areas. So we go along for a millennia or so. We get to the 1400s, and the church starts to build this thing called what we call now the doctrine of discovery, based largely on 3 papal bulls in the 15th century by Nicholas V and by Alexander VI, Dom Diversa, Romanus Pontifex, and Inter Caetera. And basically all 3 of these together, what they do is they give European monarchs everything they find. Everything they discover, it's yours. Of course, you need to tithe on everything you find, right? But if you find land, you can use the land. If you find people, you can either convert them, you can enslave them. They're yours to gain from financially in whatever way that you can. The doctrine of discovery. The church does that. And that was like an amazingly long time ago, and it was. And as late as 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court cited the doctrine of discovery in a ruling against the interest of indigenous people living in the land now known as the United States of America. 2005. So the remnants and the residue of this stuff, you can't wipe it off. It won't, it's there. So that's one piece of the puzzle. And how did we get the way we are, and why do folks feel like white folks are supreme or superior? Well, because, the Pope said we can have whatever we found, wherever we found it, and do with it or with them whatever we wanted to do. And we did. We did. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. Who said that? Ronald Reagan or John Winthrop? John Winthrop said it first in a sermon entitled A Model of Christian Charity in 1630. And the price of that city on a hill, desolation of continent? Not yet. I mean, it's still functioning, but certainly genocide and the enslavement of a race of people. And then we go from there. We're talking about what happens when the state or the government has religious authority, or when the church has political authority, governmental authority. Increase Mather, Harvard president, makes this profound assertion. It is better that 10 suspected witches, not convicted witches, just suspected witches, should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. I thought that was rather benevolent of him. This is probably one of the first steps that Harvard took on that slippery slope of liberalism. We're not going to persecute all the witches, but some of them, Interestingly, some smart person at Yale, whose name I can't recall, said that Mather's work, the Ecclesiastical History of New England, from its first planting in 1620 until the year of our Lord, 1698, is foundational to a lot of, it's sourced a whole lot by people who want to try to impose a Christianized view of America on our contemporary society. And that's one piece of our puzzle. There's a whole lot of religious sounding stuff in our history books that got put there by folks who were pretty devout practitioners of their religion. And you don't know how to sort through all that. You don't know how to separate it. And what people fail to understand is we watched the colonies do the colony thing. It wasn't great fun for everybody. I mean, as long as you adhered to and conformed to the expectations of whatever religious perspective your colony had, that's fine. But if you were by chance a dissenter, or if you saw, your conscience dictated that you wanted to speak or understand or connect to God in a different way, you were in trouble. Folks got locked up, folks got beaten, folks got expelled from colonies. That all happened in America before America was America, so that by the time we got ready to be America, there were a group of people who had the ear of some of the people who were doing the writing. And they said, hey, this has got to stop. We need to be free. We need to be truly free to worship God as we see fit, or to not worship God at all. And that's what all that colonial period taught us about religious freedom. And yeah, that wasn't the way it always was, but the way it had been certainly opened the door for a better way for us to be human together. And for the most part, throughout our history, this strict separation of church and state has served us well. We've not had too many wars over religion, but it's always there. It's always at least a subtext in every major conflict we have in this country. There's a religious dimension to it. Whether it's authentically a religious dimension or whether it's just somebody trying to spin a religious angle to gain advantage in whatever dispute it might have been, you don't know. In Americans, they're clever folks. But anyway, next piece, slavery. Onesimus and Spaniard and their siblings. Slavery, as we all know it, would not have happened, could not have existed in the United States without the approval and participation of the church in its many and varied colonial expressions. It just wouldn't have happened. It couldn't have happened. At that time, well, if it had happened, there wouldn't have been it couldn't have happened. The church, people lined up for the church to stamp whatever got done. The church had real power in those days, but the church went along. The church didn't resist the enslavement of a race of people, and they helped make it happen. The church created the narrative, the soundtrack, if you will, for the enslavement of a race of people. We learned and we took our text, our holy text, and we read them in a way that made it make perfect sense for Africans to be enslaved. We convinced ourselves and we convinced them and we convinced the world that what we were doing was exactly what God always intended to be done. And we felt good about it. We felt good about it because those people were heathens. They were living on a continent where nobody had ever heard the Christian story before. And we brought them over here by the shiploads and we told them about Jesus. We were doing them a great big favor because according to the understanding of some Christians, if they'd never heard the Jesus story, when they died, they would have spent eternity in hell. So really, we're doing them a favor. Wouldn't have happened without the work that the church did. John Winthrop, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, leading Christian preachers of their day, all owned slaves. John Winthrop owned, and his father, Onesimus and Spaniard. At one point in the 1700s, half of the Christian ministers in Connecticut owned at least one human being. Even the Quakers, in their early days in colonial America, enslaved people. John Woolman, his whole ministry was to travel up and down the seacoast, sitting with friends, sitting with fellow Quakers, trying to convince them to free their slaves. That was his whole ministry. And he was successful in that. The Quakers eventually get to the point where they renounce slavery. And then there's John Henry Hopkins, 1792 to 1868. He's the first Episcopal bishop of Vermont and the 8th presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the United States. And he is good buddies with Leonidas Polk, bishop from Louisiana, who resigned. I don't know if you're a bishop and you join the army, do you have to resign? But anyway, he didn't go into the army as a chaplain. He went in as a general. Because I think he might have been a West Point grad too, Polk that is. But the army he joins is the Confederate Army. And anyway, there's a war. And our buddy here in Burlington is the presiding bishop, and he's trying to hold his church together. And by church, I mean the national church. And so he does one book and one pamphlet, and the title's not very brief, but basically Hopkins is not pro-slavery, he's pro-American, you see. And he understands that doing away with slavery would cause great harm to our country. And it's just not the time for it, basically, something like that. So he writes a pamphlet saying, I wish it didn't exist, but it has to exist. And then he writes a book, much longer book, and says basically the same thing. For every candid observer agrees that the Negro is happier and better as a slave than as a free man. Yeah, that's the Episcopal Bishop of the United States, presiding bishop. Now, interestingly, Hopkins does some incredible stuff. He's really not the kind of, except he's a proponent of slavery. But he is so into educating primarily white children that he starts a school in Burlington, and it goes belly up. And he can't stand the thought of his school closing, so he goes and mortgages his house. School still goes belly up. Now the Bishop of Vermont doesn't have a house to live in. And that's when the Episcopalians in Vermont buy Rock Point. Have you ever been to Rock Point in Burlington? They build the bishop's house at Rock Point, and they don't give him the deed to it. They let him live there because they want their bishop to have a place to live. And I don't think the bishop still lives there. I don't know. But anyway, interestingly, side note, the Bishop of Vermont, the Episcopal Church in Vermont, Diocese of Vermont, is now an African-American woman. So I don't know how the Right Reverend Hopkins would feel about that. So, lots of pieces. And I don't know how they all fit together, but they are pieces of the same thing. Our story. So this guy, he's a towpath driver. He walks a mule down a canal, towing barges on a canal. He eventually, he spent a year at Williams College and went to some other little school on the frontier for a little while, came to Williams for a year, and then went back and eventually becomes president of that college in Ohio. And eventually the war breaks out, and he becomes also a general in the Civil War, fighting for the United States. And he had not had a clear mind about slavery until he was in Corinth, Mississippi, and he was watching all these refugees flee, and he was seeing slavery for the first time. He wasn't reading about it in a newspaper. He was seeing it for the first time. And he said in his diary that day, the fact can no longer be denied. The Union can never live in these states except with the broken body and the shed blood of slavery. See, he was disciples of Christ. They celebrate communion every week. They go to the table every week. They take the bread and the cup. It's an important part of their religious observance. And what he's saying in that quote is, if we're going to have a future as a nation, slavery has to die. The body of slavery has to be broken. The blood of slavery has to be shed. We have to get rid of it if we're going to be a nation together. That general, who went on to represent Ohio in the U.S. House of Representatives before becoming the 20th president of the United States, James A. Garfield, had that moment. And that's what I mean. That's a story about our country that is infused with religious images. I happen to like the side President Garfield comes down on in that moment, but it's still a religious experience that he has there in his journal that night. In 1941, former pacifist Reinhold Niebuhr founded Christianity in Crisis to urge American Christians to support the war against Hitler. That, if you don't know Niebuhr, Niebuhr was, a theologian, an ethicist in the last century who was just seminal. I mean, just when I got to seminary in 1986, we were still reading his books. Those were standards, and if you were taking an ethics class, you were going to read some Niebuhr. Reinhold, and he had brother Richard, but Reinhold was, I think, a little better thought of at the time. And he eventually will teach at Union in New York, and he will be there when a young African-American theologian takes a post there as a systematic theology professor, James Cone. And so Cone will know Niebuhr, and they'll go back and forth. Niebuhr had been a pastor in Detroit before he went to the seminary to teach. Cone wrote of him, Niebuhr had eyes to see black suffering, but I believe he lacked the heart to feel it as his own. And although he wrote many essays about race, commenting on a variety of racial issues in America and in Africa and in Asia, the problem of race was never one of his central theological or political concerns. And that's part of what white privilege does for us. We can look at it and say, because it's not an existential matter with us, whereas a black theologian understands it's a matter of life and death every day. So I could not possibly construct a theology that didn't speak to the everyday existence, the tenuous everyday existence of the people that gave birth to me. But Niebuhr, preeminent white theologian, could choose whether or not to speak to those issues or not. And that's largely a choice that white theologians, white chemists, white doctors, white whatever had throughout most of the centuries that this country has existed as a country. 1940, the annual meeting of the National Association of Manufacturers in New York City hears Reverend James Fifield. Reverend James Fifield is the pastor of the First Congregational Church of Los Angeles. He goes by, I think he was a little ahead of his time, but he gets dubbed the apostle to the millionaires, the St. Paul of the prosperous, the apostle of big business. And he brings that reputation with him to this annual meeting of the manufacturers. And when he finishes speaking, the applause could be heard in Hoboken, so they said. I don't know. But he had just told them that Christianity and capitalism go together like peas and carrots. Yeah. Because you got to understand, 1940, where people are still feeling the Great Depression. And I hope everybody's okay. So people are still feeling the Great Depression, and part of what they feel about the Great Depression is they don't say nice things about big business. They're blaming big business for the hell they've just lived through. And big business has a PR problem. Can you imagine that? A time in this country when the corporations had a PR problem? Suffice to say, they've fixed that. But FIFO, Christianity, a lot of Christians in America in 1940. Capitalism, they go together. And so what FIFO is eventually going to arrive at as a system of thought is he's going to be an early proponent of Christian libertarianism. Yeah, right. I see those raised eyebrows, and I don't see that well, but yeah, some of you. Yeah. Christianity, Jesus, feed the hungry, welcome the stranger, visit the sick, visit the imprisoned, go the extra mile, turn the other cheek. Christianity and libertarianism don't do anything for anybody beyond what they can do for themselves. There are two more antithetical ideas, but he marries those two together, and to this day, that thought is still held and embraced by folks who say, no, the government shouldn't feed anybody. No, the government shouldn't house anybody. No, the government shouldn't do this, that, or anything. That's Reverend Dr. Fifield's contribution to the American enterprise. Politically, he's kind of a cross between Pat Robertson and Jay Falwell. His organization, Spiritual Mobilization, will play a significant role in the next decade in the Under God movement, the 1950s. That's the decade that America almost becomes a Christian nation. 1950. Churches are full of people. By some estimates, maybe half the country is going to church on Sunday morning. It's amazing. I mean, you look back, you drive through any city, any town that has churches, and you look at, there's a sanctuary, but then there are a couple other buildings, like an education building or maybe just some other adjacent buildings. When did those buildings get built? Sometime between 1950 and 1965, because everybody was going to church, and there just wasn't enough room. So he had to make more space. But there's also a Cold War going on in 1950. And there's Brown versus the Board of Education. People are scared of the Russians and those people. So, what happens in our country when we get afraid? Some politician makes hay, is what happens usually. Fortunately, for a lot of this decade, Dwight Eisenhower was the president. So you're not always going to be blessed with somebody who has some character. But that didn't keep other folks from pushing the needle. Under God is added to the pledge in 1950. In God We Trust is made the official motto and added to all the money in 1950. And Ralph Flanders. Anybody vote for Ralph Flanders? The U.S. Senator from Vermont. I know some of you might have voted for him. Ralph served on the subcommittee of the Judiciary. And one day, Ralph introduced an amendment to the Constitution. And it read, "This nation devoutly recognizes the authority and law of Jesus Christ, the Savior and ruler of nations, through whom are bestowed the blessings of Almighty God." And his intention, it was an amendment to the Constitution. Like, Bill of Rights, that list, that's what he was tracking toward. You'll be shocked. It never made it out of the subcommittee. But it did get introduced. We almost became, there was a lot of words and a lot of rhetoric. We really, there really was this fear that the Russians were coming, the nuclear war. Maybe it was guilt because we had dropped 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we just knew as soon as somebody figured out how to make one of those bombs, they were going to drop it on us. I don't know. But we got awfully religious, and it lasted long. It's kind of like we got really religious after 9/11 for about 6 weeks, kind of really religious for a whole decade. And then the 60s came, and a decade of turbulence, Vietnam, hippies, assassinations, and civil rights. And I don't know what's going on, but it's crazy. And then in 1979, Paul Weyrich, a name you may or may not know, invents abortion. In response to the IRS threat to take away the tax-exempt status of segregated Christian schools, the religious right got energized and focused. They knew that complaining about not being able to deduct contributions to racist institutions would not be an issue that would get voters to the polls for their side. And they thought about it, and they said, how can we get people to vote who will elect the candidates that will help us do what we want to do? And Weyrich suggested abortion, and now, in 2024, maternal mortality rates are on the rise in the United States of America, just 45 years later. That became the issue. None of those folks, a lot of those folks, especially those folks, if they were Southern Baptist, it had only been like 6 years earlier where at the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention, they had passed a resolution affirming Roe and the right of women to have access to reproductive care. But that would change, and they would walk back from that in due time. So, January 6th, 2021, not 1921, 2021. This prayer gets prayed in the Capitol. And I don't know if I want to read all of that, but it gets kind of repetitive, but it's a prayer, and it's religious, and whoever prayed it is praying it to whoever they perceive God to be. Most of the people who assaulted our Capitol that day were white folks. And most of them are still alive. The great majority of them are still alive, which would not have happened if they had been people of color. It just would not have happened. And then in 2022, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act is signed into law. 77 years after Emmett Till's death, a century after such legislation was first introduced in the U.S. Congress, and after over 4,000 African American men, women, and children were lynched in the United States between 1877 and 1950. 2022, we make it illegal to lynch as a hate crime. All of those are pieces, and once you start to look at them and think about them, you probably come up with just as many pieces and work them in there that shape our understanding as a nation and our identity, our religious identity, where we think religion ought to be, where it could be, why we think it shouldn't be everywhere. And because we're Americans, you think about it one way, I think about it another way, and we used to, we used to be okay with people having different ideas about issues, and we didn't all have to think the same way about everything. I don't know if we'll ever get back to that or not. But white Christian nationalism by the numbers, and Andrew Whitehead is, I don't think that's his group. I'm not for sure. Andrew Whitehead is one of those people who does demographics and poll numbers and stuff, but I don't think the Public Religion Research Institute is where he works. But they did an American Values Atlas and asked people 5 questions or to respond to 5 statements The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. The U.S. law should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from... Somebody needed to tell me to change the slides, man. Yeah. Anyway, I'll go back and show y'all all those slides when we're done. Because anyway, if the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. God has always called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Adherents were people, and 10% of the people who responded to this survey were adherents. And these Americans overwhelmingly either agree or completely agree with all 5 of those statements. Sympathizers are people who agree with most statements on the scale, but are less likely than adherents to completely agree. Skeptics are the people who disagree with most statements on the scale, but they are less likely than rejectors to completely disagree. And 30% of the folks are rejectors. And these are Americans who completely disagree or reject all 5 of those statements. Notes of interest. Oregon has the fewest adherents and sympathizers at 17%. Massachusetts has the next fewest at 18%. North Dakota and Mississippi have the most adherents and sympathizers at 50%. And 28% of Vermont respondents scored as adherents and sympathizers. That's only 6 fewer than Texas. So that's kind of where we are with the numbers. Where are these white Christian nationalist folks, and where do they live? And turns out they live in Vermont, at least in part. They live everywhere. And they're not all, you can't just put them all in one pigeonhole. There's nuance, there's spectrum, and there's perspective. So what do we do? I would suggest you read a book, because when I don't know what else to do, I read a book. And this book is actually one we're going to start reading. Shelley, when are we going to start reading this book? In October, the first Tuesday in October, we have our first meeting. And this is Andrew Whitehead, and his book is American Idolatry: How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church. And there are others that, you can look at. And some of those we have read already here in book groups at church. And some of those are just books that I have read. But being informed and understand that the history of our country, surprise, it's complex, and it doesn't always fit into our assumptions, or what we always thought about it. So it behooves us to be thoughtful. But the pressing question is, how do we get along? Presumably we all, we joke a lot about, because it's just an hour away, maybe moving to Canada, but I think we all, for the most part, want to continue to be Americans, but we'd like maybe to have nicer conversations with each other, right? So how do we come to that understanding? Are we so polarized that we can't go back? Or have we always been polarized and just didn't realize it? I don't know. Let me stop talking. Do you all have any questions? Yes, sir.
So I'm wondering if, since civility in our society seems to be under attack, is the prevalence of the possibility that the person you're trying to discuss something with having a gun on his or her person, does that help us to stay away from trying to have discussions? Is that possibly a disincentive to having discussions with one another? And another word, just a point I would like to make, the word Christian. I thought a Christian was somebody who believed in Christ. But I've learned that a Christian is somebody who goes to a fundamentalist church.
That's right.
That's what I learned
That's
when
right.
I went into a place where that was the definition. I just was blown away by that. I always thought I was a Christian, but I'm not good enough Christian for a lot of people in this country. But I just wonder if the combination of that viewpoint and people having guns doesn't make it awful tough for us to try to speak to people. You know?
Sure gives you something to think about, you know. I'm happy to talk to you, but I'd rather not get shot. Yeah. Yes.
I'll just comment on that. I think we have to all learn to be better listeners. I live next to a person in Connecticut who is not a Christian nationalist, but he believes he's an ever-Trumper. We are civil. We can talk because I listen to what he has to say and I try to reframe it to him in ways that address and acknowledge and validate the things he's concerned about. I don't think we really truly listen to each other as well as we could. I think we have to, because continuing the way we are is not got a great ending to it.
Listening is very, very important. Yeah, and not just to start to formulate, you know, a rebuttal, but just listening to hear, you know. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, well, question, comment, whatever. I'm just thinking, you know, ahead to November, I read a statement that Bernie Sanders made about, like, that we could quite honestly expect that if the Democratic ticket wins, that there's going to be even much more galvanized uprising with the same kind of the thing that happened last January 6th and 2021. So I almost feel like, I mean, it's similar to climate crisis preparedness or whatever, I really appreciate this discussion because I feel like there might be this kind of, like, really serious eruption of, like, yeah, and maybe there's all these people among us and we don't really know if they're, what do you call them, adherents or this kind of doctrine or extreme Christianism, you know, but all of a sudden they might like really come out of the woodwork and be really, really angry. And, or, you know, also, you know, Trump could win too, which would be, of course, really frightening. But it's frightening either way.
Yeah.
Because if Trump doesn't win, I would imagine that on a community level, there might be quite a lot of backlash.
There's more than one avenue to disruption and chaos, I think, you know. A number of scenarios could,
Right.
yeah.
I mean, we're living in very chaotic times right now, so I just
Yeah.
I really appreciate this discussion. I think it's very
I mean, we hope, we vote on the 5th and we get up and go to work on the 6th and,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, Paul.
So your question, I think at the end was, what do we do? And some of these comments sound like what we do is live in fear. And so what is the antidote to living in fear? How do we not live in fear? And I think that's part of what this movement is trying to do to other us. We cower in front of that fear. And how do we not do that? And if I mean, I'm not the most studied Christian, though I taught some Sunday school, church school, I guess we call it here. It's all about standing up to that fear, right? It's about people who said, I may be in danger doing this, but I know what's right and I'm going to do it. And so what I feel like I need to do is not cower in fear, but to see what that morality is and stand up for what's right.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I have a question first, and then a comment. The other Sunday up in Derby Line, at the First Parish Universalist up there, after the talk, a young woman came in. We old ladies were already all talking about something else, so a discussion didn't develop. But the young woman said, and we had had the talk, the church talk on immigration and the new crackdown on the racism and all. And she said, isn't it really all about Christian fascism? That was the first time I really heard the term Christian fascism. But then, so my question is, do you think she was talking about the same thing in using the term Christian fascism?
Yeah, well, I can't really
Well, she
speak
didn't use nationalism.
for her, but
Well, do you hear that term?
yeah, I mean, we know what was on the belt buckle of German soldiers. Yeah. Gott.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, in God is with us, or yeah, Mike should know. You speak all them languages, Mike. Yeah.
Well, that has my comment there.
Christian fascism was the question, and you hear that term, and I think it's, I was brought up to never compare anybody to a Nazi. I was brought up never to compare anything to Germany in 1940, because there was no way you were ever going to be talking to anybody or experiencing anything that would ever be comparable to what happened in Germany in World War II, because we all learned our lesson. And we're never going to be that hateful again, and we're never going to be like that again. So don't ever compare anybody to Hitler or to the Nazis or to anything that happened to Germany in 1940. But people who say Christian fascism are talking about what they perceive, I guess, as a government system that uses Christianity in much the same way. It's interesting because the Nazis were not real pro-church people. They did what they needed to do to make the church, to Nazify the church in Germany, and then they didn't go back. They weren't devout religionists in that way. They were much more. Their religion was Nazism, and they didn't. But they did, they did make sure that the church was on their side, and that's where, outside of that, that's where we get Bonhoeffer and Niemöller and the Confessing Church and the Barmen Declaration, where they said, that's not Christianity, and they drew a pretty clear distinction between that and what Hitler and the Nazis were trying to get the church to do. But Christian fascism would be a fascism that tries to use the trappings, the words, the vocabulary of Christianity to enhance, impose, prop up, a kind of fascism.
Where does the Zionists and the biblical chosen people stuff fit in with this?
Oh, you know what? I didn't get around to my comment. Remember I had a comment?
You had a comment?
Question.
What was your comment? Go ahead.
My comment is, you don't really have to be terribly devout or pious to be encouraged to be less fearful with just the scripture. Fear not, neither be afraid. Matthew 28.
Yeah. Where did the...
Oh, well, you don't have to be pious or devoted Christian to take comfort from. Matthew 28, fear not, neither be afraid, nor know that I'm with you always, even to the end of an era.
Yeah. Thank you. What's your question?
biblical roots of Zionism and the chosen people nonsense?
Different lecture.
This is contemporary, you know, I mean, there's a slaughter going on, and,
Well, there's certainly no separation of church and state right now, doesn't seem to be, but don't all these observers tell us, don't buy the propaganda that this is a religious war. It's a right-wing political.
right,
Well, I'd like somebody to actually define what they mean by Christian.
Wait, hold that, Charlotte. Did you have a question?
Well, I comment about the fascist idea, the definition of. I have a 96-year-old friend, a woman who's been working with Poles like for 75 years now. And just for fun, when the idea of fascism first came up and people started talking about it, all the way back in 2014 and 15, I asked her how she could define it after living through World War II and that sort of thing, and being a political person all of her life out of the care for humanity. And she said fascism, despite all other things, begins when the corporations control the government.
Oh, that's the.
Yep, and then we went on to talk, and I said, where does religion come into this? And her simple answer was, guns, you know, are religion. And politics sometimes can be a religion. And when people take these things to believe without understanding, not faith, but just belief, when they take these things, then we have the perfect seedbed for fascism. And I can see as I travel the country playing music with the purpose of trying to speak about such things, people would say, oh, how in the world did Hitler ever happen? I thought, just look around you. It happened so subtly, you know, so carefully in some ways. And so when I think now about the greatest issues that we face, I realize that not just institutions with godlike aspirations are religious, but people become religious in the idea of things like guns, and that's to answer your question. Right?
Yeah. Charlene?
Yeah, I hear his terms, but somebody should just define them. And how many, you know, I mean, do we all, everybody agree about the definition?
That's a great idea. And, you know, and it makes perfect sense. And the reason I included 4 definitions of Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, in the outline is because I thought the same thing as I was preparing for that. You know, there'll be, maybe it'll be a long definition, maybe it'll be a couple of 3 sentences.
We hear what they want, what they think they want, but what do they really want? And what does the other side really want?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is what I want actually defined in small little words, you know?
I'm really frustrated trying to do that.
There could be a website for that, it might
No.
be run by somebody that you don't want to listen to.
I don't want bumper stickers, I want to hear it from a real person, you know?
White Christian nationalism is not a religion. It's an identity. It's an identity that others, people on the margin, and favors a particular kind of religion and favors a particular kind of people to the benefit of those people and to the harm and diminishment of those who are othered. That would be my best off the top of my head definition of white Christian nationalism. Somebody's getting rich off of it and somebody's being impoverished by it.
Me too, but what you were saying later about how you care about your neighbor as yourself, you know, things like this, real Christian values. And why are these people reacting this way? I mean, this is wonderful. This woman said she talks to her neighbor, and I see control on both sides, actually. I see a lot of control. You know, you are supposed to believe what they believe, or else you're an enemy. And the other side is the same way. You know, you're always being checked out to see whose side you're on, so that they want to know whether they can like you or hate you. I mean, this is just everywhere.
Walking down the center of the road is dangerous. It really is. It really is. We're a little over the hour, but I'll stay as long as you want to talk. But if you need to head on, feel free to do that. But thank you for being here, and yeah, appreciate it. And thank Kyle. Yeah.